I think that we're live now. Hello, everyone. This is Selena, and I want to welcome all of you guys here. Today is a really awesome day because we have with us Laura Dietrich, and she is from California. She is a functional medicine practitioner. She's got a background also in Chinese medicine and acupuncture. And today we are going to be talking about Epstein-Barr, what it is, what we can do about it, and how do we know if we have it? So I want to first welcome you and thank you for joining us today, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is so exciting for you to be here. I'm so excited that you're able to share this with our community. The first thing, let's just delve right in here because there's a lot of things that we want to cover. And the first one is, what is Epstein-Barr? This is a new thing that seems to be coming up on the horizon. We're hearing a lot more about it is EBV. So can you tell us what is Epstein-Barr?
Yeah, it's definitely come up on the horizon lately. I think probably due to medical medium. I think anybody that's heard of Epstein-Barr has heard of medical medium, and he kind of brought it to the limelight, but now all these people are starting to look at, past research studies about it and understanding it more from a scientific point of view, really. So Epstein-Barr is a virus, as we know. It causes, and this is at least in most people, it causes mononucleosis, glandular fever, it's called in the UK. But after that initial mono phase, it kind of goes dormant and lives in our bodies pretty much for forever. We don't know if we can really eradicate it completely. It's probably not a good idea to eradicate it completely, but it's kind of just dormant like any other. It's a herpes type virus. So like any other herpes type virus, like chickenpox or herpes simplex virus, herpes zoster, which causes shingles, all those classes of viruses, they'll just stay in your system. And with Epstein-Barr particularly, we know that it can now reactivate. When it reactivates, it kind of looks like mono, but it mostly more looks like chronic fatigue syndrome. So at least in the scientific literature, they don't know exactly why it reactivates. There's definitely a lot of theories as to why it reactivates, kind of within the bigger picture, the bigger realm of immune dysfunction. So in a nutshell, that's basically what Epstein-Barr is. Yeah, and to go back to what I was saying originally before, even if you didn't have mono necessarily, you might still have Epstein-Barr. 90 to 95% of the population has it in their system. I've known people that have sworn they've never had mono, and we test them for Epstein-Barr and they do have Epstein-Barr in their system. And sometimes it can just look like a mild flu bug that lasts for a week, and not necessarily mono that lasts for, 4 months or whatever. So most of the population has been exposed. Some people are definitely more susceptible to reactivation. And we kind of have, at least at this point, we kind of have different theories as to why that is.
Mono was something we used to hear about all the time. Like growing up, I remember a lot of times there was always, it seemed like there was somebody in our class that had mono.
Yeah.
But then it's now, the EBV, the connection on it. So if you've heard about mono, more than likely, you know quite a bit about EBV, basically.
Right.
So that's one of the things that isn't out there a lot because a lot of people don't realize that, yeah, that's the same thing. So
Yeah.
how do we get EBV? How do we get this? Is there some ways that we're more susceptible to get this or to be affected?
Like I said, like 90 to 95% of the population has been exposed. You get it. It is so easy to get it because you get it through saliva. That's why mono is called the kissing disease. You can also get it through blood transfusions. If you've ever had a blood transfusion or given blood, they don't test it for Epstein-Barr beforehand, so you could get it that way. But then obviously, saliva is the most common way to get it. Yeah.
What are the symptoms of Epstein-Barr?
So the symptoms of mono, so like I said, the symptoms of reactivated Epstein-Barr are a little bit different than mono. Mono really looks like a flu. You feel like you've been run over by a truck. All of a sudden, you have a sore throat, you have swollen lymph nodes, you have headache, body aches, that kind of thing. Reactivated Epstein-Barr looks more mild on the lymph node, sore throat area, but even possibly more extreme on the chronic fatigue front.
And so how does it contribute to that chronic fatigue?
So it's interesting, I want to say this was back in like the 80s, maybe even before that. They had, when chronic fatigue syndrome kind of came on the rise and people are learning more about chronic fatigue syndrome and trying to figure out what's causing it, they used to link it to Epstein-Barr, and then they did all this testing on people with chronic fatigue syndrome, and they found that it wasn't linked to Epstein-Barr, but I still have my doubts now. Just because, especially now, even within the last 10 to 15 years, we've had a lot more advances in terms of testing and how to interpret those tests. So testing for Epstein-Barr, I actually should talk about this too, and I have a note about it. But I'll go over testing for Epstein-Barr. But testing for Epstein-Barr can be pretty elusive, just like anything else. No testing is 100% definitive in any direction. It's pretty good right now, testing for Epstein-Barr, as long as you get these 4 antibodies that I'll talk about. But I suspect that when they first kind of tried to link this to chronic fatigue syndrome, they might not have known as much about testing for the specific markers of Epstein-Barr or understood that. And, there's so many other factors that can go into chronic fatigue syndrome, like Lyme, mold, toxicity, heavy metal, there's so many different things. So it doesn't mean that chronic fatigue syndrome is always related to Epstein-Barr, but because of this kind of greater picture of immune dysregulation with the reactivated form of Epstein-Barr, I find, like in my practice, and I work with chronic fatigue syndrome, I find reactivated Epstein-Barr is usually in like 30-ish% of my clients. Wow. So yeah, it's a good number. And obviously, and I'll talk about this later, but other factors need to be looked at in the greater realm of immune dysfunction and chronic fatigue. But that's definitely often a big part of it. And in terms of testing, I wanted to just go over how to test for it. And it's really important it's important to get these 4 specific types of Epstein-Barr antibodies. Okay. If you're getting them through your doctor and you just ask your doctor for EBV antibodies, they might order a panel that doesn't have the most important marker. The most important marker to test for reactivation of Epstein-Barr is called early antigen IgG. So I could go forever about this testing, and I won't. But if you're going through Quest's just very simple panel for Epstein-Barr does not include early antigen, and you have to get it separate. So if your doctor's using Quest, just know that you're going to have to get acute infection antibodies and early antigen. LabCorp's Epstein-Barr panel does have all 4 antigens, so that's what's nice about LabCorp. Cash price, it's usually a lot cheaper too. If you're not working with a practitioner, or if your doctor refuses to order these, you can get these on your own from walkinlab.com. They do use LabCorp, so you just want to get acute infection antibodies by LabCorp. So early antigen is the most important marker for reactivation. The last study I read said that it was elevated in 10 out of 11 cases of reactivated Epstein-Barr. Wow. IgM is usually the one you look at for the mono phase. IgM's only in reactivation about 40% of the time, so not nearly as reliable as early antigen. Early antigen can stay raised in about 20% of cases, even after their Epstein-Barr reactivation is better. But if you're correlating symptoms with the test result, that's really the best way to do that.
Right. Yeah. So it really makes sense that you need to be working with a practitioner that can put those together and realize it, understand the test, not just order the test, but make sure that whoever that you're working with can say, okay, look, this is what the IgG, what it means, the IgM, because it's, so the test results, you've got to put them into context. And so right. The other part of that equation is having someone like Laura that can say, hey, look, this is what these things mean, that understands, how to put those things into context. What about autoimmunity? Like how does autoimmunity fit into the picture?
So there was a study that just came out in April of this year, which was huge. And it was like all over the place. You might've seen it. Other people that were kind of in the Epstein-Barr world, this was just a big deal because it was in a lot of like conventional medicine journals and things like that. But they linked, before this article, they really just linked Epstein-Barr with Hashimoto's. And that's a big one on medical mediums thing too, is linking it with Hashimoto's. But there is a lot of scientific literature linking Epstein-Barr to Hashimoto's. And Hashimoto's, as we know, is so common. Mm-hmm. But recently, this article back in April has linked, I think, 7 additional different autoimmune diseases to Epstein-Barr involvement. So multiple sclerosis, we kind of knew that somewhat from different studies beforehand. Lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile arthritis, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, and type 1 diabetes. So all of those were very interesting. There's also been distinct scientific links to lymphomas, so cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Burkitt's lymphoma, which I think is more common in Africa, and nasopharyngeal carcinomas in the nose, and B-cell lymphomas too. Yeah, so it's been linked to a lot of different things.
Yes, a lot. I mean, it just kind of hits that whole immune response system like all over the place. So it's no wonder like it kind of makes sense of the chronic fatigue, because any of those things, you're going to have fatigue when that body's in that fight or flight mode and you've got that sympathetic state engaged, you've got this immune battle going on. We're going to have fatigue long term. So it only kind of makes sense that they should link it to the chronic fatigue, because there's just so many our systems that are involved in that.
Right, exactly.
What about Lyme? You kind of mentioned Lyme. Like, what's the connection with Lyme?
So this is really interesting, and I actually wrote an article about this on my website last night, and I'm like so fascinated with this connection, just because Lyme and reactivated Epstein-Barr, there's so many clients I have, so many people I talk to that are so confused as to which one they have, if they have both, like what's going on there, because they present so similarly. Like chronic Lyme, not acute Lyme necessarily, but the chronic persistent version of Lyme, really similar to the chronic persistent version of Epstein-Barr. They present with swollen lymph nodes, extreme fatigue, joint pain, muscle aches, headaches, brain fog. So they look really, really, really similar, and they're both kind of hard to test for. Epstein-Barr is usually a lot easier to test for. In general, Lyme, as we know, can be kind of a mess to test for. But there's studies linking both of these things with each other. So there's studies linking, there's not a lot of studies at this point, but there are a few. Basically, there's a study done where two different people presented with typical Epstein-Barr / Lyme symptoms. They were tested for Epstein-Barr, both positive for like the mono phase of Epstein-Barr, then tested for Lyme, positive for Lyme, given antibiotics. So as we know, antibiotics would be more specific for Lyme because it's a bacteria. They don't work on a virus like Epstein-Barr. They were given antibiotics and their symptoms completely went away. And then they were retested for Epstein-Barr and the Epstein-Barr was gone. So that doesn't really make sense. And then there's another study or different kind of stuff in the literature about the other way around too, having an actual Epstein-Barr infection, but then testing positive for Lyme, but then antivirals work. So we don't know exactly why this is. It's super interesting to me just as a practitioner, because I'm always thinking of these links, and I feel like so many of my clients are dealing with both kind of. So yeah, this is a really fascinating link. And the question is really like, is the Epstein-Barr virus causing immune system overload, and that's what's causing Lyme to reactivate, so the Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria to reactivate, or the other way around, is Lyme entering the system, the Borrelia bacteria, and that's causing a dormant Epstein-Barr virus from an old mono infection to reactivate. So that, we don't know exactly. I feel like it might be decades before we know the exact answer to that, but there's a very, very interesting link there. I tend to treat Epstein-Barr first, and if we're not getting anywhere in like a month-ish, then I will look more closely at Lyme.
Okay, that was gonna be one of my other questions. Is okay, what do you do about treatment-wise? Like, which do you? Because it's like you got which comes first, the chicken or the egg here,
right?
And so, and then it almost seems like it's kind of maybe even also one of those catch-22s that if you've got one that causes the other, and it's just that juggling that. So you start with the EBV first, and then go on to the Lyme. And you expect to see some kind of results within at least a positiveness in the first month then.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean it would completely turn around in a month, but if we're gaining headway in a month, then I'm confident that we're going in a good direction. Obviously, if we ever hit a plateau, then I might think, beyond looking at factors like mold or other toxicities, then I might think, okay, let's look at Lyme. And then the reason I do it that way, there's no real good rhyme or reason. This is kind of just the way I do it. Lyme testing, the Lyme test that I like to use, it's a test by a company called Global Lyme Diagnostics. I think I was going to get into this later. Actually, no, I wasn't. I'll just get into it now. Global Lyme Diagnostics is a company that tests. So Borrelia burgdorferi is like the very typical bacteria that causes Lyme disease, technically. There's many other Borrelia bacteria. There's dozens more just in the United States alone that can also cause Lyme that the conventional testing doesn't test for. So if one of those, bacteria is involved, then obviously the test is going to miss it. The test can also miss Borrelia burgdorferi too. So testing is just really, it's just elusive and hard for Lyme. But Global Lyme Diagnostics actually came up with a test that tests for the outer surface protein of all species of Borrelia. So it doesn't matter which species it is. It won't even tell you what species it is because it doesn't know. It's just looking for that outer surface protein. So that's why I really like that test. And then they'll also test for co-infections. Co-infections are another issue with Lyme, things like Bartonella, Babesia, all these other Mycoplasma, Ehrlichia, all these other mostly bacterial pathogens that can often go along with Lyme. But testing for Lyme can be pretty expensive. That test is around $1,000. So yeah, and there's so many theories about just the greater immune dysregulation, and maybe once we start to take care of Epstein-Barr, then Lyme will kind of go dormant. That's one theory. Some people think like if you're exposed to Borrelia, you're getting Lyme. But there's a lot of, I was at a Lyme conference a few weeks ago with this Dr. Ty Vincent, and he kind of developed this thing called low-dose immunotherapy, which is really awesome for Lyme. And he has a lot of success with it with Lyme. And he has very blatantly said, I am not convinced at all that Lyme is a Borrelia infection. It may be more of like an allergy to the Borrelia, but there's so many people that have Borrelia in their systems that don't have Lyme disease. So that's like a whole nother topic, but there's no like true rhyme or reason why I do Epstein-Barr. First, it's probably just because it's really expensive to test for it
for the other.
Yeah.
And you've seen good clinical results by doing it that way, that
right.
There's not really any reason to go another way. So
right.
then how is there any other ways that we know? So you've got some tests that you can do, like the four antigens or antibody test. And then are there any other tests that you'd like to do? Or is there is it just symptoms, or what are other ways that we know that, hey, we may have this?
For Epstein-Barr specifically?
Yes.
That's really the main one. I know that like immunoscience labs, they test for 5 different antibodies, and Dr. Voljani, who started immunoscience labs, he's a researcher and PhD, and he's great on so many levels. He kind of has studies backing up a reason to do a 5th one, but that's definitely not part of LabCorp or Quest or any common lab that you could get through your doctor. There's also testing for the actual DNA of the virus in the blood, and that's been kind of proven to be really elusive because Epstein-Barr hides from the blood. And so that's really the main one. The only other thing I would add to that maybe is what I usually do is I do quantitative, and I hope this isn't too confusing just for people that are getting this testing on their own, but practitioners, like you could definitely get this through them. Quantitative IgG and IgM. You can actually add that on if you're getting your test from walk-in lab. But if you do quantitative IgG and IgM, it will show as long as you're in range with IgG and IgM, then you shouldn't have a false negative, meaning if you have lowered levels of total immunoglobulins of G and M, then you might get a bad reading for the Epstein-Barr portion because you don't have enough to make that Epstein-Barr reading make sense. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. I find that that's really rare. I test that on all of my clients up front, is the quantitative IgG and IgM, and I find it's really rare that they would have lowered levels of that.
How do you get rid of it? Like, what do you do if you've got your clients, they test positive? So what are the ways that we say, okay, we can overcome this?
Yeah. So yeah, really the heart of this webinar. So for mono, and I really don't work with mono ever, but for something like mono, it would be really easy to help bring that virus back down into dormancy. You use herbal antivirals, which I'll talk about in a minute. But for reactivated Epstein-Barr, it's kind of this huge picture thing. Like I was mentioning before, it's the bigger picture of immune system dysregulation and understanding why why the immune system is taking such a hit that it can't control the Epstein-Barr anymore. Because we know that it could at one point. It's like you had mono, it went away, and now it's back. So what happened in that time period that made the immune system go crazy and not be able to handle the reactivation anymore? So that's such I mean, that's kind of the basis of my entire practice, is looking at all of these things that contribute to immune system dysregulation. So, so yeah, that's a hugely important part of this process. So I'll talk about like specific antivirals in a minute, but looking at things like mold toxicity, I have this written down because I make sure I didn't want to miss anything. So yeah, main ones I see: Lyme and co-infections, mold, toxicity, and parasites or pathogens in the gut. Even like Blastocystis hominis, you know, protozoan parasites, H. pylori, things like that. Anything that's causing the immune system to take up all of your soldiers and not be able to handle the Epstein-Barr. Those are probably the main ones. And then other ones that are just as important, but I don't see them quite as commonly, are just things like, you know, chronic stress or adrenal fatigue, HPA axis dysregulation, involvement of the thyroid, other environmental toxicities. So certain things in groundwater, you know, pesticides, organophosphates, those kinds of things. Electromagnetic frequency waves. This one's super interesting. There's actually a study on the effects of electromagnetic frequencies on viruses and how it causes them to like move a lot faster and replicate a lot more. Obviously poor nutrition due to diet or due to malabsorption, which might be due to, you know, inflammation or leaky gut, that kind of thing. There was one study connecting poorly regulated blood sugar to more viral activity, which was really interesting as well. And that poorly regulated blood sugar can also be part of the greater picture of adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysregulation. And then other viruses like human herpes virus 6, cytomegalovirus, herpes zoster, herpes simplex, all of these other herpes classes of viruses, if the immune system is overloaded with those as well, then that, you know, obviously might be a factor. So those ones are a little less common. Another common one, well, not quite as common, but one that's really important is mercury toxicity. There's been links to mercury and Epstein-Barr. So if you have a leaking filling, then that might be part of, you know, the greater picture of that. But yeah, so moving on to, if you have anything to add, please let me know.
It just sounds like there's so many things that are intertwined,
yeah.
That it was huge, like this just web, and it's like everything is all interconnected. And I just started, as you start talking those things, like, well, is that classic catch-22 scenario where any of those things are going to cause a very stressed GI system, which then now it perpetuates the other, and it just really can get really out of hand. And so
yeah,
where do you stop this cycle? Then, okay, let's get this runaway train, like, just stopped.
Right. Yeah, I know. And as you know, that's kind of like where functional medicine excels, because like we're just looking at how everything is playing onto everything else and figuring out that big puzzle. So that's why functional medicine is so great for so many things, but especially for chronic fatigue syndrome, reactivated Epstein-Barr. It's like you're looking at everything involved. So it's like a sustainable approach.
Yeah, you're not just like, okay, let me give you a prescription for this symptom and that, and then you're going to end up with like 50 million prescriptions at the end of that, because it's like so many things. If you start peeling back those layers, then it's like, wow, now we have this pile of puzzle pieces. Now we can finally start putting them together, you know, if we pay attention to those pieces and the way that they're connected. So yes.
Yeah, definitely. So I will talk about specific antivirals. But first, I'll just talk briefly about food. So food for Epstein-Barr, the diet that I tend to use the most is the Walls protocol. I'm sure, I think most people have heard of that. Yeah. So I love the Walls protocol just because it works on the mitochondria, and the mitochondria will pretty much always be damaged in like a long-standing Epstein-Barr infection. And of course, if other things are contributing like mold or other toxins or Lyme, or that all damages the mitochondria. So we're kind of working on getting energy levels back at a very like cellular level. So that's why I love the Walls protocol, very anti-inflammatory. The only other thing I would add to that is eggs, which is interesting. Medical media, I'm not to talk about him too much because I know he's not science technically, but he mentions eggs as well in his books. And then there was a study that came out I think this is a fairly new study actually, that shows that people with Epstein-Barr, reactivated Epstein-Barr, are more susceptible to have egg allergies. So that was really interesting. It kind of, that link is very weird. But obviously, if you have a sensitivity to eggs, then you're just going to perpetuate the cycle of inflammation and all of that. So I recommend all of my Epstein-Barr clients get off of eggs, at least for the time being. Besides that, Wald's protocol. Another interesting thing about Epstein-Barr is it's the only virus that causes citrullination. So it takes arginine, the amino acid arginine, and turns it into citrulline. And it's those citrulinated antibodies that have been linked to autoimmunity. And that may be why it's linked to all these different autoimmune diseases. So arginine is, it's an amino acid found in red meat and seafood and all that. I don't necessarily recommend like giving those up completely. I've gotten great results with my clients that don't give up, high quality red meat and fish and all that. But just beware, like don't take an arginine supplement. I know not a lot of people take arginine supplements, but I know some bodybuilders do. So that's an important one. And then, so besides that, foods, specific antivirals, there's so many. There's really so many for Epstein-Barr. I'll kind of tell you my favorites, but there's a lot in the scientific literature. I think they're finding out more every day. There's some that are specific for Epstein-Barr. There's some that are specific for herpes viruses, some that are specific for just viruses in general. I mean, there's just so many things to choose from. So I'll first say that, because people ask me about medications a lot, and obviously if you take your results to a conventional doctor, they might try to give you prescription antivirals. There's definitely like studies saying that they kind of work in Epstein-Barr, reactivated Epstein-Barr, kind of. Things like Famvir and Valtrex, which are more specific for herpes simplex type 1, but since this is a herpes virus, they're not, I don't think they're FDA approved for Epstein-Barr yet, but I found clinically they don't work that well. I find clinically herbs work way, way, way better. And there's way more studies for herbs killing off this virus. So, and they tend to have more side effects, obviously, than herbs. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. As you know, as we all know, I'm sure. So yeah, favorite antivirals, selenium is huge. Selenium can be toxic in high amounts. So I usually recommend 800 micrograms a day for like 2 weeks. And then you can kind of back off to maybe 400 micrograms. Selenium in excess of 1600 micrograms a day has been proven to be toxic in some people. So you just want to be careful with selenium dosage and make sure that you are, taking all of your other supplements, multis, all of that into consideration with this dosage as well. That is it blocks viral replication. So selenium is great for Epstein-Barr. Proteolytic enzymes are super cheap and great as an antiviral. They've been studied as being an antiviral. If you have any joint pain or muscle aches, they can also be really great for that as well, because they tend to help so much with inflammation. I usually recommend like 2-3 times a day between meals, so they don't act on the actual meal, they're acting on the virus itself. And then methylation is a huge deal with viral replication. Methylation is kind of can intervene in the process of viral replication and that virus kind of hacking your genes and your DNA. So methylation, just understanding that and making sure that you're getting enough methylation support with vitamin B12 and the methylated version, or adenosocobalamin or cyanocobalamin, not cyanocobalamin, sorry. Adenosocobalamin or hydroxycobalamin.
Hydroxy.
Yes.
I knew what you meant. Yes.
Yeah,
I should clarify for others.
So yeah, things like that. Folinic acid actually has a specific, not folic acid, folinic acid has a specific study linking it to being really great for chronic fatigue syndrome in general, and also people with chronic fatigue due to Epstein-Barr. NAC is a big one, not just because it helps with methylation, but it's also the precursor to glutathione, and glutathione in itself can help rid the body of toxins. It's the master antioxidant, can help with mitochondrial support. NAC is great. That's one of the other ones that I use as like a starting thing for my patients with Epstein-Barr. You can do up to 1500 milligrams 3 times a day, which is a lot. I don't really ever go that high. I usually start with 600 3 times a day between meals, 600 milligrams. Another huge one that most people have probably heard of for herpes viruses is lysine. So lysine is an antiviral amino acid. You can do, I usually actually do 1,000 milligrams 4 times a day, starting off with that between meals, but you can go up to 2,000 milligrams 3 times a day. So 6,000 milligrams total. Another great one. So I usually start with that, NAC, selenium, and monolaurin, which I'll get to. Another great one, if you have extreme brain fog, is alpha lipoic acid. Alpha lipoic acid has a very direct link to blocking virus replication. Alpha lipoic acid, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, so it's great for brain fog. It has a very short half-life in the body, so taking smaller doses a lot throughout the day is more beneficial. So if you can handle it, or if you can remember really, taking like 100 to 150 milligrams 6 times a day could be really beneficial. Careful of alpha lipoic acid if you have mercury fillings, it can actually mobilize mercury. So that can be a good thing or a bad thing, just depending on, if you currently have the filling, or if you already got rid of it and you're trying to clear mercury from the body. Vitamin D and vitamin A, I won't get into dosages just because it's so specific and they can be toxic at high amounts. So obviously work with your practitioner to know if you're maybe deficient in any of those. But vitamin D and vitamin A both have a very direct antiviral effect. Licorice tea or just licorice capsules in general, 2 cups a day of licorice tea. Licorice tea is great also if you have like major adrenal fatigue, because it helps keep cortisol circulating in the blood longer. So it can make you feel more awake and alert, especially if you're dealing with chronic fatigue. Really careful if you have hypertension or high blood pressure, because it raises blood pressure, and that's why it makes you feel more energized. But if you're already susceptible to high blood pressure, then obviously stay away from that one. It can also accumulate in the body. So sometimes clients with licorice tea, or just licorice in general, they're taking like a capsule form, after like a month, they'll start to feel like irritable and like too energized almost. So I'll just be like, okay, let's back off the licorice. It's accumulated in your body. But if you are getting licorice capsules, I will say don't get DGL, which is deglycyrrhizated licorice, which is great for digestive stuff, but not so great at viral stuff. So make sure you get the glycyrrhizated licorice, which is the less popular form, but it works way better. And then monolaurin. Monolaurin's another heavy hitter. I usually start with monolaurin and a few other things. I use the one by Ecological Formulas. So it's 300. Yeah, so they're 300 milligram capsules. So we'll start monolaurin's so great for not only Epstein-Barr, but other pathogens too. So if you don't know if there's other gut pathogens or, bacterial issues, it can help with those as well. But you can go up to, 300 milligram capsules, 3 of them 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. So that's 900 times 3. What is that?
2,700.
2,700, yeah. So you can go up to that, and you can kind of titrate up to that dose and be at that full dose for 2 weeks. And then you can kind of titrate back down. I forget who I got this protocol from. It was another functional doc that works with Epstein-Barr a lot, but I found that protocol works really well. Another one, olive leaf, is great for so many pathogens. It has a direct antiviral effect. Barleans makes a liquid olive leaf extract. So you can do like up to 2 tablespoons twice a day. You can also, Biobotanical Research, they make Biocidin, which is a great product, but they make something called olive virex. So you can go up to 2-3 times a day. And then another important thing for Epstein-Barr is zinc. So many people are zinc deficient. I usually look on their blood test if their alkaline phosphatase level is low. I think it's below 70, kind of on the lower end of normal. That may point to a zinc and or magnesium deficiency. Right. So I usually just do both. But zinc, obviously such a good immune system booster and has a direct antiviral effect too. Those are like the main ones that I tend to use and kind of cycle through. There's so many others that have been studied to have an effect. Reishi, turmeric, Chinese skullcap, green tea, ginger, berberine, all these other things that have a direct antiviral effect, but these are just kind of the ones I no one left.
And just
That was
to
an
give them,
apple. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
whenever we have like the access to like the natural herbal stuff, it opens up this huge treasure trove of like things that we can choose from because these
Yeah.
things are going to support the body. And what I really liked about a lot of those is that, okay, these are actually going to support the body doing fighting the fight. We're not necessarily fighting the fight for it, but we're giving it the tools that it needs. Like when we start supporting that glutathione pathway, now the body can really take charge and it can, we're just giving the soldiers a few bit, some of the ammo, and now it can go do what it needs to do. So I really love that approach. Not all practitioners get that. So I really like that's what functional medicine is about. So connecting with you is just always, fantastic. Like I see you in the forums, like, that we're going to support the body to help do what it needs to do. And one of the questions that came up while you were talking, and I don't know if you've seen the discussions lately, is about like pulsing. So when you have these antimicrobials or antibacterials, do you do like the pulse method? Are you just stuck on them and okay, we're just going to take these things, or do you we're going to do them, at a certain pad, or we're going to do this much now, we're going to back off? What
Yeah,
is your
that's a great question. And honestly, I don't do pulsing for Epstein-Barr. I do it for other things. I know Biobotanical Research, who I mentioned before, they had this study where they did pulsing, and this is specifically for Clostridium overgrowth. They did pulsing for Clostridium with their product and then not pulsing for Clostridium with their product, and pulsing worked way better. So there's definitely like a time and a place for pulsing. It might work better for Epstein-Barr. I never use it. I find that I get results without doing pulsing. So I haven't felt like I need to use pulsing necessarily. I do know another friend of mine, another functional practitioner, was giving me her Epstein-Barr protocol, and she does pulsing and finds that it works. I find that pulsing can be more, it can be just more stressful on like the person's like daily regimen, because it's always changing. So obviously I don't want to add any more stress than we need to just by taking a lot of supplements anyway. So yeah, that's a great question. We might know more about that with studies in the future, but I currently don't do pulsing with Epstein-Barr.
All right. Awesome. And there was genetics was another question that I had, because you're mentioning things like the methylation. And so that just opens up a whole nother door, because once we start having the methylation cycle involved, that's another
Right.
one of those catch-22s, because it's involved like hundreds and hundreds of other processes. So if we've got a blip there, then we're going to have some kind of, challenge in other areas. So have you seen any sort of specific like genetic, do you like do any genetic testing like with MTHFR or any of the other SNPs like in that methylation cycle, or even in the detox, like you mentioned about supporting that glutathione pathway? So what about any sort of genetic SNPs, down there in the glutathione or CBS or any of those other SNPs? Do you do any of that kind of testing?
Right.
Or
I don't do genetic testing. I'll definitely I think it's interesting. I know that, there was that one study that came out a few months ago that said that a lot of genetic testing shows that you have genes that you don't really have. And it was just kind of I find genetic testing can be useful and can definitely correlate. When my clients come to me and they've already had genetic testing and I look at it, I'm like, oh, this is really interesting, and, figure all this out. But I don't do genetic testing in my practice. I just do for methylation. I do up front, I do the organic acids test to look for methylation issues there. And that would also, the one by Great Plains, which is the one I use, also test for glutathione need basically. So I'll do those for those two things. But beyond that, I don't really do genetic testing. I think it can be useful for a lot of things, but it's just, yeah, as as functional practitioners, it's where do we stop with testing? Where do we stop somebody from spending 20 grand on testing? So yeah, I think it can definitely be useful, but I just don't currently do it.
well, the organic acid is like that other counterpart to the genetic test, because the genetic test kind of tells you, okay, here's some speed bumps, but really we've got to have that oat test to say, hey,
Right.
how are these things expressing themselves?
Right,
So
right.
kind
Yes.
of like another, because I do both, but I really, if we have to choose, I'm going to choose, how's the body expressing itself? How is it showing us? Because just because you have a SNP doesn't mean it's going to express in a bad way. And just because you don't have a SNP doesn't mean that it's not going to be problematic.
There's not an issue, right? Yeah,
Yeah, so that
totally
oat
makes sense.
test is really the way to detect that. That was going to be my next question, actually, was do you do the organic acid test?
Yeah,
So
I do. I
cover
actually
that.
do. I know I've been doing this kind of like set of testing on all my new clients where we do a lot of testing up front and then we figure everything else out from like once we get everything back. So I run the organic acids, the one from Great Plains, and I like both the organic acids, but I run the Great Plains one because I can combine it with so many other tests with
Right.
just a single urine sample. So I'll do the mycotoxin test, which is from mold, as we know, the environmental toxin test, which just tests for environmental toxicities that might be in the groundwater or your food supply. I always include glyphosate in there. And then I do the heavy metals urine test in there too. So it's like 5 tests in one. So I run that on everybody up front.
Yes, I like the Great Plains as well. So I was going to ask, okay, the next one of these things about glyphosate. Do you see any kind of glyphosate connection?
That's a great question. I haven't. Well, I see every single person I test glyphosate in, they're at least the 50th percentile, which is interesting. And it's like it's hard to tell as practitioners because we're not testing people that aren't sick, So
Right.
so who knows? But yeah, pretty much all my clients have at least 50 percentile of glyphosate. I haven't seen a direct correlation with super high glyphosate levels and Epstein-Barr yet. I don't know. That might come definitely with chronic fatigue, but that's just because I work with chronic fatigue. So everybody coming to me has chronic fatigue. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we'll see more about that stuff in the future. I feel like it's all like everything's hitting the fan with glyphosate now.
It is. It's like that's definitely front page news right now is the
Yeah,
glyphosate connection, which is kind of cool.
I know. Really cool.
Because there is a lot of connections. And you mentioned something earlier about this is way back in the beginning. You mentioned about the studies, how I think it maybe just was the connection between the EBV and MS, lupus, type 1 diabetes, celiac, and all those kinds of things. And when you look at all of those, and then you start talking about some of these other issues, like what you were supporting with, what you're using to support with like the NAC, the alpha lipoic acid, and some of these the things that you mentioned, it's like those all fit. Even with those other things, you would use very similar type of an approach. Things are going to support that methylation cycle. Things are going to support that detoxing cycle. So it's no wonder that they're all connected and that there is an overlap in them because the way that you are addressing the EBV, that's kind of where there's deficiencies and where there's problems.
Right.
Zinc deficiency. I mean, that zinc deficiency we see almost, I think, in everything.
Yeah.
Like type 1 diabetics have an antibody, like the zinc transporter 8, antibody to that. So there's somehow that's getting attacked. And so.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't even know that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so.
It all connects.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, the zinc, I mean, and you've got to have the zinc for the insulin to actually work. It's kind of like that. That's its vital fuel for the insulin. And so when you've got the body attacking that transporter, it's like, what do you do?
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. And so then it's like, well, then now you know why that they're deficient on zinc. And then you also got things like pyroluria, where you've got a zinc deficiency, vitamin B6 deficiency, which goes back to that methylation cycle again.
Right.
And so just the connections always get fascinating. Every time I hear it, even I'm constantly studying, like you are, like researching and looking at all the latest studies and all that kind of stuff. And it's just like, wow, these things are so connected.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really very, very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Was there anything else that we missed? Like, I think we covered what this is. I hope that everybody has a good understanding. Unfortunately, I'm not able to see if there's any comments going on. So if anybody's commenting, I'm sorry that we're ignoring you, but I can't see them on my screen. So I'll
answer on a typed version if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah, so we will get to you guys on that. But if you guys have any questions, let us know. Laura is so generous with what she shares. I've connected with her in like the practitioner forums. Like, she is just absolutely amazing. So this is such a really special treat that she is with us, because she has like this amazing treasure of knowledge, and she shares it so freely is just super awesome. So I thank you so much for joining us, Laura.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
And I hope you guys take advantage of asking questions so that she can answer them, because I just love her answers. Like, I just learned so much from her. So I want you guys to make sure you ask some really tough questions for her.
Yeah, definitely. Challenge me. I'm up for it.
Yes, because I think she kind of likes the challenges, because I see that she answers like she's always just pretty awesome. So was there anything else that we didn't cover that you wanted to share that we missed?
No, well, I don't think so. I'm looking over everything. I feel like there's so much to Epstein-Barr virus, but then it's like you're also getting into the greater picture of immune dysregulation, and that's endless, you know?
Right.
So for Epstein-Barr specifically, so as to not overwhelm everybody, I'll leave it there. But I mean, those are the basics. You can do a lot with that. Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned before, it's so important to look at all these other factors. That's why functional medicine is so great for things like this, and you know, so many things that conventional medicine isn't that great at, just because you're able to connect the dots with so many things that connect to so many other things, and really get better on a sustainable level. But yeah, like I mentioned before, mold, Lyme, other pathogens in the gut, all of that, so important to look at for reactivated Epstein-Barr.
Because that's one thing that even though we think that, okay, we know what we've got, we still have to look at the reason why we have it. Mm-hmm. And so still putting that same big picture, no matter if it's Epstein-Barr, if it's, you know, MS, if we have SIBO or some kind of, you know, IBS, any of those things, we still got to look at all those pictures and address the food, the lifestyle, the stresses, and why. And so the Epstein-Barr, you're saying, is basically this exact same thing, and it's no different. That we still need to approach it that way, and not just go give me my prescription and go give me my herbs for that. We still need to look at the big picture. So thank you so much for giving us tips of getting us started and getting, you know, where we can, okay, maybe get a handle on it. And, you know, if we don't resolve, then we know that's where we need to definitely reach out to a functional practitioner, someone like Laura, who can say, hey, let's look at this bigger picture here, and let's, you know, put all these things into context to make sure that you don't have constant reactivation. Because there's nothing like, okay, we've got it good for now, and then 6 months later we're going through it again, but now it's even worse.
Right, exactly.
I mean, I see that all the time, like with the SIBO and those kinds of the GI disorders. Is like, okay, well, it was great, but then now I feel worse than I did before. And, you know, this stuff, herbs things made me feel worse. It's like, well, we have to still address the reason why.
Right.
So I want to stress that. And I know that you stress that all the time.
Yeah.
You'll have to look at that big picture. So even though she shared this amazing, great information, remember the premise is that you still have to look at that bigger picture. So thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And thank you for your generosity of sharing so much with us. And you guys make sure that you guys ask any tough questions, because she loves tough questions.
Yes, so, happy.
Yes, and then I guess we'll see you all next time. And I think she's going to hopefully join us again sometime in the future.
I'd love to.
Anything else you guys would like for her to join us and talk about, make sure you guys comment or message me of any other topics, and I'm sure that I could probably talk Laura into coming back.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Selena. This was super fun.
Okay, thank you. You all take care.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye. I don't know how to end this now. My screen went blank. I'm trying to end here. Yes, this has been fun. If I can just figure out how to end it, because on the group one here, it's not ending the same.